so for me, it allowed a sense of growth in areas that I had always abdicated. I had used my communities to hold me, whereas here, with this wide open space on the mesa, I had to really be definitive and clear about what was important to me, and then create it.
Hi, and welcome to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, a weekly conversation with women who found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode 96. If you'd like more information about the podcast, it's all at the website desertladydiaries.com, and I invite you to engage with the guests, with other listeners, or me on social media, on Facebook and Instagram at Desert Lady Diaries, or on Twitter at Desert Lady Diary. Brenda Littleton is a Jungian therapist, certified life coach, retired professor of graduate writing at Cal State San Bernardino, editor at So Wise Creations, publisher, artist, poet, and environmental activist living in Joshua Tree. Prior to teaching, Brenda had a corporate life, which found her working in Japan and New York. She also spent a decade working in the entertainment industry with oddity projects ranging from Max Headroom to Zubuli Zoo, part of Hallmark Television. She came to the desert to mend from the world. Living in the desert, Brenda loves growing medicinal plants and using them to make holistic products for self-care. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dawn. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Yeah. What was your first experience with desert?
Oh, I was a little girl, and it continued all the way through high school. My parents loved to camp, so we would always stop in Joshua Tree, camp in the park, and head our way down to the river and come back. And then when I was a teenager, Joshua Tree was always a destination for soul searching and the weekends and just wandering the space.
What was your decision to actually make the move to live here?
About 10 years ago, I was going through a complete makeover in my psyche and needed a change. And I had horses. I still have horses. And I was looking for wide open spaces with community. I've always lived on the edge of society in communities that were either artistic or holistic with health as a focus. And it turned out I had several friends, long-term friends living here. So moving to Joshua Tree out on the mesa was like moving into a family. I had some really deep, dear friends here, and they just welcomed me. I made friends quickly, and I immediately found my little path into the parts of the community that I just loved.
What do you think it is? You said living on the edge of society. What do you think it is about that sort of living that is attractive to a certain group of people?
Well, there's a lot of space, physical space, a lot of privacy, and yet it's equally balanced by a finely held container of a community, people of like minds, even the diversity of getting pushed politically into areas and environmentally. Joshua Tree, while we have a sense of solidity, and it's not just Joshua Tree, it's the whole basin, what I consider Morongo Valley. But living on the edge, a sense of containment, but also open space, great weather. I love the diversity, the intensity of it, the beauty, the physical, painterly beauty of living here.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I've always lived in beautiful, beautiful places, and this is what I consider one of the outliers of civilization.
You came to Joshua Tree from Idyllwild, is that right? Yeah,
yes.
With your horses. So over and above the geographic difference of Idyllwild is super green, super cool, because it's pretty high elevation. What are some of the other differences were there differences that you noticed right away?
Well, in Idyllwild, we're living on a container of rock that resonates. It's a portal, a ley line and it has been a destination for healing for centuries. I just got tired of getting locked out in the summer for fires and having to evacuate,
right.
And then in the winter getting locked out because the roads were closed for snow. Here, while there's still the need to travel to go away from the area, it's just a lot easier in the open space. One difference that really has been a lesson for me is up in the mountain, as I said, Idyllwild is a container, and so you really are held, and you see your limitations on a day-to-day basis. You see the trees, you see the mountains, you have a sense of a small community. Here, there is no container. So the space just goes and goes and goes.
Right.
And to do your own work, to actually reach those destinations of your own making, whether it's creative or writing or home or having a healing process, without those outer walls, it relies upon the person to be really clear and definitive. So for me, it allowed a sense of growth in areas that I had always abdicated. I had used my communities to hold me, whereas here, with this wide open space on the mesa, I had to really be definitive and clear about what was important to me, and then create it.
And so what have you created since you've come?
Oh, well, it's crazy in the sense that it's important to me, and it's probably not going to be important to anyone else who doesn't have horses. But in the 10 years I've been here, my horses have not been sick one day.
Wow.
They really resonate here. And that reflects me as well. I resonate here. I've created a sanctuary where I'm able to grow my plants that I work with. I have a studio. I have an area where I see clients that come and do their own healing work. I love doing my photography here. I mean, this is a photographer's...
It's a dream come true.
Bliss, right?
Right. Even if you're not a photographer, if you've got a phone, you could be one.
Yeah, so it's been, and financially, it's a lot less expensive for me to live here. I'm driving less. When I first moved here, I was still commuting to the university, and that was arduous. And so within a year, I changed course and found employment here in town, and was able to really sink myself into the community. It was the first time I've ever lived and worked and played in one spot.
Without any commute or,
Yeah, I felt really lucky.
So take me through the process of living in a corporate environment and life, to the entertainment industry, to therapy and healing people.
I've been really lucky in finding odd positions that through time develop and flourish in areas that I had no experience in. And I was really fortunate to find people who are willing to groom me and to train me. And I look back now and I'm just amazed at the synchronicity of aligning myself and just be willing to show up and go through. I think it's almost, I was too blind and fearful to really understand what I didn't know. I didn't know what I didn't know. So I had been living in Canada for 10 years and came back and was married, and I wanted to work, and I answered an ad for an executive assistant for this environmental company. And within 4 years, it grew from a very small remediation abatement company to a major player in the world. And I moved from assistant to a VP, director, and was running a $10 million ad campaign in the United States for awareness and training safety procedures for environmental abatement. So anything from asbestos to lead paint to leaky underground storage tanks, and working with DOJ, Cal OSHA, EPA in 21 states. And then that caught an eye of an international investor in Japan who was looking to sniff out the US market. And so I ended up being based in Tokyo, Hokkaido, in northern Japan. Spent 3 years going back and forth on these jets. It was very, very intense.
Did you learn Japanese?
I did.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's great.
Arigatou gozaimashita.
Oh.
Yeah. But again, living and working in that level, everyone spoke English. So it was kind of redundant. But so while I was working in the corporate field, I had to develop a lot of collateral material for PSAs, advertising, print material. And I worked with an advertising agency and a PR agency. And so I was pushing through a lot of money through contracts for them. When the corporate joint venture ended, I had established a fairly close working relationship with a production company. And they just allowed me to just segue over and become one of their producers. One of the shows that they were licensed to was a Hallmark product, a children's show, Zoobly Zoo. And it had been shelved for 10 years, and the agent involved bought it back. And we ended up doing production across from Universal at Riverwood Studios, which was the special effects studios for, I forget, it's one of the shows. No, I can't remember. But it was all the pods, and you'd be walking through the special effects of sci-fi. And
oh, wow.
So I did that for about 8 years. And during that time, I really learned my capacities, and I learned endurance, and I learned resiliency, and I learned how frustrating it is working in those systems where you really want to excel, and yet there's a lot of interference, and a lot of the successful people are really good in dissolving that interference and still maintaining their integrity to the project. And I found it overwhelming. There wasn't enough reward for me in that to continue somebody else's dream. And one day I just decided to go back to school.
Wow.
And I was living in Idyllwild. There was programs in Palm Desert. And at that time, I did not have a degree. I had lots of
work experience.
I had a taste of classes, but I never really completed my undergrad. So I completed my undergrad, and then within 18 months I had completed a master's. That master's had a project where I wrote a book on postmodern and quantum science, and using quantum mechanics to really allow the individual access to their own literacy. So that meant creativity, understanding, communication, that there isn't one right way. So really postmodern in the thinking. And I won an award, and to receive the award I had to teach, and I had never taught anything. So one of the teaching assignment was in the master's program that I had graduated from, and it was a graduate program. And so all of a sudden I found myself going from the studio and freeways and meetings to the lecture hall. And it was very satisfying. I loved researching. I loved the idea of, okay, this is the information that has to be deconstructed into various ways for the different forms and ways of learning. And you have to deliver this over a period of time and be available to assist anyone in their hurdle. And that felt good. That felt great. And I loved it. And I did that for 12 years. That's when I moved to Joshua Tree. And I realized I was done with the system, the university, and I went back to school for a counseling degree. And again, didn't know what I didn't know. And was really fortunate. It was a moment of confusion that worked out so well for me. At the graduate program in the counseling, I had to find an intern position immediately within the first 9 months. And I called our local hospital thinking of dealing with hospice. I had had a lot of death in my life and wanted to learn more, and had thought, well, working in a local hospital, providing counseling for hospice was great. The interview I had on the phone said, well, come to this office in this shopping area and we'll take it from there. I went to the wrong space. I went to the wrong office. I walked through the wrong door. And instead of walking into talking to someone about providing hospice care, I walked into Unity Home.
Oh my goodness.
And the executive director was a retired professor from Cal State Northridge and from counseling, and her being an ex-Cal State professor, me being an ex-Cal State professor, her having 30 years of counseling, and me being a newbie, it was just an immediate love affair. And she was my first supervisor and threw me into it.
Well, and for someone listening who isn't familiar with Unity Home, could you just describe a little about what that is?
Well, Unity Home is a nonprofit in Joshua Tree, but it's funded from various areas in the basin, and it's a domestic violence shelter program, and they provide so much more. There's in-house counseling, there's education, parenting education. They work with the district attorney's office. When I was there, I provided assessment service for victim witness. They have a safe house. They have housing for 2-year seamless program for usually women and their children. And so while I was there, I was really fortunate to be able to create a literacy program that I thought was going to be for children. But it turned out that the parents really wanted it and needed it as well. So I got to pull in all my training. But then when I finished the counseling, I realized there were some management changes at Unity, and I left and did a short year at Pacific Clinics and worked in the schools. But I really wanted to work with the individual again, and as well as go back into my old self as a photographer, a poet. Became certified in trauma. I went back for art therapy, therapeutic art therapy. And so now I'm really enjoying my own ceremonies, being driven to just work with my intuition on this is the information that I believe is healing me and allowing me to resource myself. Still working with clients who also give me feedback saying, well, that's interesting. Would you be able to share this on a wider scale? So this year I've just begun to take my own writing, my own classes, and share them online, doing videos, upscaling my work that way, and still practice service in small group forums here in the community.
Right, one of which I attended a couple of weeks ago. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
That was Life After a Narcissist, Healing Yourself for Health and Happiness.
Yeah. What I found particularly interesting about that was the physical connections.
The polyvagal theory.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I have been studying the difference between PTSD and complex trauma. A little segue, I had been working at Copper Mountain teaching, and quite a bit of my students were military vets. And often they would come to see me and say, I love the work, but I just been diagnosed with PTSD. And yet they would talk about physical concerns of not just being able to concentrate, but panic and shame and the difference of guilt. And that got me thinking I need to have some research on this. And so, again, really fortunate to have peers across the U.S. A therapist in North Carolina specializes in complex trauma and has been spending a lot of time looking at narcissistic trauma. And I was reading her material, taking some of her classes, going into other research, and there's a huge difference physically. The symptoms that the body carries in complex trauma is very different from PTSD. And we've been working in a realm of assisting people under the auspices of diagnosing PTSD. And so there's a big chunk that's left out. Dealing with shame, a chronic, long-term condition that starts from childhood, adolescence. We kind of rely on that patterning of a go-to place. And the body does not discharge shame the way PTSD discharges when we have the freeze, fight, or flight moments of trying to compensate and deal with fear and survival. And so I've been fascinated by this huge body of literature. I mean, there's a lot of research out there that people have been researching and doing case studies and working with clients for about 12 years. And it takes that time to really feel comfortable in bringing your research, talking about case studies and saying, there is this other little faction, this other way that if we look at how we can incorporate into the main modalities, we'll have greater success in providing relief. But there's a lot coming out right now. My focus has been on, my belief has been on, yes, we need the professional body of literature and we need the professionals, but I believe that the more the individual can feel confident in practicing their own daily practice, their own investigation of working with their body, it will augment and support and provide a sense of continuity and congruence if they are working with a professional.
Well, and two, it also gives an individual that sense of, I'm healing myself and I have conquered this, if you will. I don't know that that's the right word. Or I have at least come to understand why these things are happening to me, and shift focus to then what we can do to make it better. Or there was a piece of the class that you said almost being thankful that that person was in your life to bring you to this place of focus.
Yeah. Well, you're highlighting my research, the benefits of being with a narcissist.
Right.
And a lot of our programming comes from being a child in a family with a narcissistic parent, that we may not have the ability to name it or to verbalize it until much later, after a series of relationships, whether it's a partner, a boss, a mentor, it could be your doctor, your coach. It's anyone that has that imbalance of power. But we allow ourselves by, it's not so much how do they find us, but we have this resonating experience, this pattern of this is familiar.
Right.
And we're not cognitive of reaffirming that pattern until there are certain thresholds in life from a Jungian perspective, 40, 50, 60 of those decades, where our ego that has been so important in survival starts getting, it's not so much tattered on the frayed edges as it just becomes, I've done my job and soul wants to come in. And so as the ego retreats a little bit, there's some open playing field. And so we allow in this aspect of soul, our psyche, and it will not put up with anything that's not valid.
Right.
So we start looking at what needs to change. So the benefit of having a narcissist in your life, or a narcissistic personality disorder, those symptoms, if we give ourselves the grace and the patience, and it usually comes after a lot of personal wrestling, we actually take a couple of breaths and we say, what is this really about? And we see, okay, I was hurt by this action. So you identify the hurt. And then I really am disappointed from this outcome. So you identify the disappointment. And you also identify how would you prefer the outcome. And little by little, you start piecing it together and saying, this is how I would prefer it to be. And my work is based on, well, then let's allow you to create a life. Let's give you the methods to go for those desires, and you self-heal. You actually bring it into your life. And the narcissist is one of the best mirrors to say, this is what you really need, this is who you are, this is what you want, and I'm just going to agitate and create a toxic environment so that you cannot ignore this anymore. And it is a lot of work, but it's even more work to stay where you were.
For sure. Let's shift gears to your medicinal plants and using them for holistic products and self-care.
Well, my great-grandmothers and fathers and my grandparents and even my own parents and my aunts and uncles had a deep lineage and practice of herbalism, probably because they lived in situations where that's all they had, in Ireland and then Vancouver Island and very unpopulated areas. So I grew up with the norm of going to a plant and growing plants in your own yard for recovery, anything from mint to some of the deeper plants. So here on the mesa, if a plant can survive, it's pretty intense.
Yeah.
The resiliency in these plants here are some of the most potent I've ever come in relationship with.
Right.
So I can't grow everything I want, but I have olive leaf extract that I make. The rosemary here is so intense. The active properties are almost magical. I grow sage, a couple different types of sage, all the culinary herbs. I also grow certain types of flowers that I use for flower essences.
Oh, nice.
And so I make the essences during certain times of the month and then infuse them with an oil from the blue lotus from Egypt. So more archetypal, historic essences, then I blend with the flowers and the herbs here.
And what do you use those for? Just some examples.
Well, one example I had was when I first moved here, one of my horses had skidded and just shaved off her whole flank.
Ooh.
And was exposed, and it was hot, and there were flies, and there was infection coming in.
Ugh.
And there's no way to bandage it. It was too wide, and it was an emotion area. You couldn't bandage it, and it was rapidly becoming necrotic, and I was panicking. It's like, what do I do with this?
Sure.
And I have beautiful creosote bushes on the 5 acres, and I immediately went into research mode, found some ancient recipes for distilling the creosote and making a spray, a spritzer. And with that, I added golden seal, and I just started spritzing and putting poultice. Within 3 days, the raw flank of this horse that was going deeper into the muscle had completely scabbed over. The oozing had stopped, and within another 5 to 7 days, it was healed.
Wow.
It was so intense. So I really started investigating plants in relationship with people where you are. Like if you are in a place where you have plants, those plants tend to assign their allegiance to you. It sounds a bit crazy, but there is this relationship. They are aware of you, and if you work with them, they will work with you.
It's almost a little bit like seasonal eating, if you will. You know, the fall comes and we get all of the squash and the pumpkin and all that stuff, and that for various reasons is the stuff that we should be eating at that time, and then we move into a hotter time of the year, and there are different fruits and vegetables that become available because that's whatever properties they have. It's likely that we need that in our system
at that time. Yeah. So
Right.
there's a marriage. And
Right.
so listening to that awareness just boosts the whole system, the body system. The olive leaf extract that I make is incredibly potent. I have some jojoba, but not enough to harvest. But the sage, we grow great sage here. There's several others. I have been experimenting with Simpson oil, the buds from marijuana.
Yeah.
I have 2 friends with severe advanced cancer, and to find that RSO oil on a consistent basis has been worse than dealing with the cancer in many ways. So I'm assisting in their recovery by making that. And again, the intensity, the heat, just making sure, of course, there's always the issue of wind and watering. And so even just recycling wash water.
Right. Did you get any rain this morning?
No, I didn't.
We had just all of a sudden I was walking around in here and you hear that noise of water. I'm like, what is that? That's water. And I immediately went to the front door and had a few drops come down. I just went out and stepped in it for a few minutes and came back in, but it didn't last, and then it was gone. So, yeah.
Our monsoons are starting already.
Yeah, exactly. Just that little bit is exciting, though.
Yeah.
I mean, and then it can turn deadly. It's that story of the harshness of the desert, like you mentioned, the wind and the heat, and then the rain comes, and that can be so devastating, as we saw last fall. We had some difficult situations. So if someone were to come to you, Brenda, and say, you live out in the desert, I'm thinking of moving out there, what would you tell them about moving to the desert?
Good question. I would tell them to stay where they are and to leave us alone. I have seen so many, the influx of population and development since I've been here for almost 10 years is amazing. But on the kinder side, I would suggest that people, if they're making a change and it's a lifestyle change, to find a very simple place with property that they can grow food or grow something around them to allow them to be part of the system, and to really assess their lifestyle, and in moving out to the desert, to feng shui their life, to really keep what's truly important to them. In the class I just gave last night of Living Your Mandala, it's reducing down, finding all the different personas and reducing it down to 4 that are non-negotiable in the day-to-day. So in moving to the desert, find that core part of you that's non-negotiable, and find a situation, create a situation where you can develop that to the best possible way. And know that whatever situation one experiences here, it's for that personal growth.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I'm so glad you came today. Thank you very much. And thank you for the work that you're doing on all of the individual healing. That's so important. There are many people that are here for healing in the desert, and you're a great resource to have for that. So thank you.
I appreciate being invited. Thank you so much.
Before you go, though, I'm going to have you select 4 numbers between 1 and 50, and your answers to those questions will be available to my ever-generous Patreon supporters. So if you would give me those 4 numbers, please.
Okay, 1, 15, 30, and 50.
I'm going to read those questions. Number 1 is, you find a lottery ticket that ends up winning $10 million. What would you do? Then we'll go to, was there a trait you recognized in yourself at a young age that you still use or has led you to a particular vocation? How do you cope with stress? And last, what was the first paying job you ever had and where was it? So if you would like to hear Brenda's answers to those questions, go out to desertladydiaries.com and click on the support tab, and there you will find 2 different ways to support the podcast, one of which is Patreon, and the Patreon supporters have exclusive access to the Diary Unlocked portion, which is where all the juicy stuff happens after this part of the podcast. Thanks again for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dawn.
If you celebrate the 4th of July, I hope you had a great one. And how about those earthquakes and aftershocks? For those of you in California, it's not only the threat of an earthquake, but can also be evacuation for wildfires. It's always good to be prepared with at least 1 gallon of water per person for up to 3 days, some non-perishable foods, cash and small bills, because if electricity's out or Wi-Fi, none of those point-of-sale devices will be working. A flashlight and batteries, meds, wet wipes of some sort for hygiene, toilet tissue, garbage bag or 2, and maybe even a battery-operated radio, solar lamp, and spare reading glasses, pen and paper. Also supplies for your pets if you have them, along with a small bag of a change of clothes and sturdy shoes. I usually eat and replace that non-perishable food about every 6 months, and I also have a sheet of paper listing important phone numbers and or account numbers, because again, if electricity is out or Wi-Fi is out, we won't have our devices to depend on for those phone numbers of people that we may want to call to let them know that we're okay. If you're looking for a more comprehensive list or other suggestions, you can always check out ready.gov/build-a-kit. That's BUILD-A-KIT. And if you have other suggestions of things that you prepare ahead of time, email them to me at desertladydiaries@gmail.com so I can share that with everybody else. If you're enjoying this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe and share it with a friend. And if you're interested in other podcasts, here's one you might want to check out.
Science fiction stories and interviews blasting straight out of the Mojave Desert and beyond. Space Cowboy Books presents Simultaneous Times Podcast. Free to stream on your favorite podcast player. Find out more at spacecowboybooks.com and be sure to visit our store in Joshua Tree, California.
And it's a great little store they have in Joshua Tree, California, and they also do so many free community events. So if you're local, come and check it out. If you're in town visiting, make a point to go and check out Space Cowboy Books. See you next week. Thanks so much for listening.